According to Sutton, Fletcher Fraud had been on the verge of publishing an article exposing a number of local worthies, councillors, businessmen, local landowners, wealthy and influential people. He claimed they were involved in serious misconduct, though quite what kind of misconduct was not clear. In fact, until Fletcher Fraud asked him to come round that night, he had not been aware that he had been working on anything in particular, let alone something that would result in sensational revelations. But when Fletcher Fraud phoned, he sounded almost crazy, and Sutton realized he'd better humor the old guy at the very least. The story he'd gabbled over the phone had been high on emotion but low on detail. Sutton just knew that things had reached a head, and he thought his boss was probably having some kind of breakdown, which is why he decided to go.
But, so up to then, Fletcher Fraud had kept all this to himself? That was risky, wasn't it? Given it supposedly implicated local bigwigs. Hard to believe that in a small community, something wouldn't have leaked out.
You're right. Fletcher Fraud had been very excited about his findings. Sutton had picked up on that, and so I suppose others might have picked up on it too, particularly if he'd been nosing about asking questions.
Or looking at records, or whatever. It's a pity we don't know what the article would have been about. That might have given us a clue.
We mustn't jump ahead of ourselves here. Firstly, we need to establish that something sinister has actually happened to him, and then, if it looks like it is, that would be the time to look for signs that his behavior might have alerted the bad guys that he was onto something.
But we don't even know if there are any bad guys.
Exactly.
If he was onto something, why now? What made him put himself in the firing line, if he did?
Well, there is a germ of an idea that we might explore. Apparently, he'd been facing the threat of redundancy, or at the very least, an enforced early retirement. According to Sutton, he believed that these revelations, the article, were going to save, or even enhance, his career, or so he believed.
Sounds desperate, and this sounds like a last throw of the dice. Maybe he was a bit careless, reckless even, but, of course all this assumes that something sinister has happened to him.
Which we don't know.
Exactly, and we're going to look pretty stupid if in 3 weeks' time, he turns up on his own doorstep, fresh from a holiday in the Bahamas. Alright, assuming he did have some dirt on some powerful people, how far would they really go to keep him from publishing?
It depends on what he had on them, though his disappearance would have proved very convenient for anyone who even thought they might have some dirty linen in their closet. I suppose how extreme those actions would depend on how dirty that linen was.
So who knew about his finding?
Well, that's unclear. Certainly not his staff at the Echo. At least, that's what Sutton thinks.
And how does Sutton know that for sure?
It seems Sutton was a protege of Fletcher Fraud. He's taken him on as a cub reporter, and Sutton had repaid his confidence by really delivering the goods over the years, even saving Fletcher Fraud's job on occasion, and indeed, arguably, saving the paper too, which had been threatened with closure, or at least to becoming an online outlet, which would have meant redundancies for pretty much all the current staff. But that was 20 years ago, and although Sutton is now pretty much the last remaining out-and-out reporter on the paper, since it is increasingly dependent on advertising, they may have decided he had served his purpose and could now be offloaded. They weren't to know that Fletcher Fraud had one last card up his sleeve, which might well have saved them all.
He's the only reporter?
Well, there is a trainee who sometimes tags along with Sutton, or covers things like the local flower show, but she's also expected to muck in with the less glamorous side too.
Glamorous?
You're right. Don't forget, we're talking about very local issues here, farmers' markets, the Amateur Dramatic Society's next production. It's not Woodward and Bernstein, no one's going to win a Pulitzer Prize, and the paper's margins are razor thin.
So, although the staff had a vested interest in keeping the paper going, if they didn't know about the scoop, then maybe they wanted Fletcher Fraud out, so he could be replaced by a more dynamic editor who might have saved the paper, and their jobs. So, talking about profit margins, who actually owns the Echo?
If we pick this up, that's something we might want to find out. Anyway, over recent years, though more so, over recent months, Fletcher Fraud seems to have left most of the work to his staffers and retreated into his office. In reality, Sutton was the only person in whom he would really confide. Even Sutton was concerned that Fletcher Fraud might be losing it, but he felt this loyalty to his old mentor, and, despite the apparent signs that he might be cracking up, he went along with Fletcher Fraud's ways, essentially covering for him. At a price though, it seems there was a lot of jealousy inside the paper. People envious of the bond between Fletcher Fraud and Sutton. They thought Sutton was manipulating Fletcher Fraud.
Anyone in particular?
Well, it's a bit of a stretch, given that this is all hearsay. but the word is that Morris Johnson, the deputy editor, had been eyeing the editor's chair for some years, and it was no secret that he couldn't wait to get his feet under the editor's table. But, like I say, bear in mind, this is all office gossip, and we only have Sutton's version.
So did Fletcher Fraud share his findings with Sutton?
Well, that's the thing, and that's why we've got on board. Reading between the lines, the reason Fletcher Fraud asked Sutton round that night was to show him the evidence that he had amassed. Together, they were going to collate and shape the evidence into the big story it would no doubt have been. What Sutton didn't know was precisely what the evidence was about. And, it seems, nor did anyone else, except possibly the person or persons who may have made sure that evidence never saw the light of day.
By silencing Fletcher Fraud?
Possibly. The other odd thing is that Sutton couldn't find any sign of documents or files or photos, or anything that might have been the evidence.
Well, if Fletcher Fraud left of his own accord, he would have taken that with him. Maybe he got wind that someone was onto him and decided to take off before it was too late, which is why he left in such a hurry.
But how did he get away? His car was in the garage, and no one seems to have been near his house between the time he got home and Sutton arriving.
And we're sure Sutton had nothing to do with it?
We're not sure of anything, but it seems unlikely. If he was involved, why would he get us on the case?
Good point.
Now, you might think, in the light of these revelations, that the police might have taken more interest in his disappearance. After all, Fletcher Fraud had informally discussed his exposé with the local crime commissioner, though, to be fair, given the commissioner's arm's-length role, his allegations were probably not yet common currency even among the local police force, and so might not have filtered down to serving officers.
How do you know this?
It seems Tony Sutton is a fan of the show, and since the police are continuing to show zero interest in the case, he decided to contact me. It's now been 6 weeks since Fletcher Fraud's disappearance, and the authorities are no nearer discovering what happened to him than they ever were. Not that they seem to have put much effort into it.
Why's that?
Good question. The simple answer is that they think he may have just gone away of his own accord.
But what about the phone? Or the milk pan? Or the fact that he left his keys? Don't they think that's suspicious?
You'd have thought so, wouldn't you? But apparently not. As far as the authorities are concerned, there is no evidence of a crime having been committed, and as an adult private citizen, he is entitled to do what he wants, as long as it is within the law. They point out that hundreds of people go missing every day, so they are treating it as a simple missing persons case. Routine.
And how do they explain the doorbell CCTV, which showed him entering but not leaving? And why would he just go away? Particularly if he was about to break a big story, especially if it might save his career?
I asked Sutton about that, and he said that the police never even looked at the CCTV, nor Fletcher Fraud's own CCTV. He says they just weren't interested. The popular version is that he was under a lot of pressure, that he'd become secretive, distant even. Apparently, the inside view in the Echo office was that he was on the verge of a breakdown. The official view is that he just walked away, literally, and that seems to have been good enough for the police. One thing though, the crime commissioner, Sutton, contacted him. He denied Fletcher Fraud ever had a conversation with him. That might explain why the police have backpedaled on the case. Question is, did they make that decision themselves, or were they instructed to play it down, maybe on the grounds that they didn't want to create a public panic, what with the burglaries and some other odd unexplained incidents?
Like what?
Like a case of a haystack set on fire, and other minor instances of arson, never anything of real value.
And what is the police's view?
Kids, teenagers, just vandalism really.
That's a nice easy get out. Do they have any proof it was kids?
Don't know. There was one thing Sutton mentioned though, something he got from a friendly copper on the duty. Apparently, at the site of the first burning haystack, they found what? He says he saw what looked like a symbol of some kind burnt into the ground.
A symbol?
Yes. Thing is, the sergeant who was sent out to the site of the fire didn't make any mention of it in his report.
So how do we know there was a symbol or sign?
Sutton's tame copper was with the sergeant at the time. He pointed it out.
And?
He says the sergeant just didn't want to know. He stomped over to the mark and started poking at it with his shoe, just kicking dirt and leaves about, scuffing it all up until it was completely gone. He said not to waste his time, that it was just something made by an old tractor tire. Anyway, when the young copper raised it again, he says the sergeant put him in his place in no uncertain terms, and told him not to include the mark in his report, that he would look stupid if he did.
How could he do that?
He just said, not to be stupid, it would just complicate the case.
Meaning what?
I suppose he wanted to be able to put it down to those convenient kids. Could have been just laziness. Simple as that. Who knows?
So there was no official report that included the mark?
No.
Well, maybe it was a mark from an old tractor tire. Maybe Sutton's copper was being a bit fanciful.
Maybe. Anyway, I don't really see how it ties in with the disappearance, so let's focus on the main facts as we know them. We have the official police version. He's gone AWOL due to pressure of work. And we've got Sutton's suspicions that something's happened to him.
The police version is plausible, I suppose. And they might well have wanted to avoid frightening the locals, what with the burglaries and everything. And he could have wanted to just get away for a bit. It was all coming to a head, and it tipped him over, so he just had to get away. Are we sure there's a story in this?
No, that's why I'm seeing Sutton tomorrow. If it's all a waste of time, I'm pretty sure I'll pick it up, from his body language, how much he sticks to what he's already told me. It's very nice down here, but I've got other projects on the go back home. I'm not going to stick around for a second longer than necessary.
So when are you seeing Sutton?
Sutton emailed me a few days ago and then we did a FaceTime call. He spelt out the background to the case and his suspicions, and that is why I'm here in Romsey.
See, any gut feeling seeing him on the video?
No, it wasn't a very good connection. Kept dropping out. I'll get a much better impression tomorrow. So, just for the record, I'm staying at the Red Lion on Market Street. It's in the center of Romsey, and at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm meeting Tony Sutton in the lounge bar. If this looks like it's got legs, I think it would be a good idea for you to come down to Romsey too. But it might be better if we didn't let on that we know each other. Anyway, it might all come to nothing, so we'll just have to wait until I've seen Sutton.
Is it me, or has this restaurant got noisier?
It is loud, isn't it? Let's go back to the
I
office.
just had a thought.
Yeah, what's that?
If someone, it actually sounds like more than one person, saw Fletcher fraud as a danger, because of the evidence it was believed he had collected, then what's not to say that they might also think Sutton is also in the know, maybe with copies of the evidence too? If Sutton is right about what's behind Fletcher Fraud's disappearance, then Tony Sutton is in danger too. We need to warn him.